All right. Coming at you all the way live from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. I am proud to announce my very special guest that I have on here today. Shall I refer to you as Professor Johnson?
You can just call me Cedric, man.
Oh, Professor Cedric Johnson. Talking to us live from down south. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
No, man. We were having a good off-air, pre-recording, get to know each other phone conversation that I like doing so much. I do miss having people in studio. It's a very different vibe. I'm inviting you down here, Cedric, when you get a chance, when all this stops, to come down to Oakland and check this place out. It's a very historic building that we do this show in. I don't know if you saw Boots Riley's movie, Sorry to Bother You.
That's right. I've seen it.
A lot of it was filmed here in this building.
Okay. All right.
Even some of the outside shots of the hood. We're done here in this building.
Nice.
Well, one thing I saw, I've been watching some YouTube videos of you of late that have popped up. Looks like you've been making the rounds, if you will.
Right.
And I've also been reading your pieces in Jacobin. And I'm going to be linking all that on the description of this show. And one of the things that you hit on that is like my big fear with all the protests, the uprisings that we're seeing across the country, and the toppling of Confederate monuments, the painting Black Lives Matter on city streets. My fear is that this movement that we're in the middle of could possibly get co-opted. What is your take on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I'm of two minds about it, right? There's the reality that some of it has already been co-opted, and it was so easily co-opted because it wasn't necessarily incompatible with corporate ways of thinking and talking about diversity, right? There's certain ways of thinking about the market and how everyone should have access to it that wasn't incompatible with what I think the most mainstream notion of Black Lives Matter is, which is it's a demand for equal protection before the law, right? It's a demand for full recognition of African Americans as citizens, within the context of liberal democracy, right? And that's not incompatible if you work at Microsoft or Google, right? Even if they're not going to engage in aggressive hiring, right? That as far as marketing, public relations, that's something that they can assimilate, right? And so I think there's that part of it, right, where as I mentioned in one of the pieces that came out, last month, there's ideological convergence, maybe more so than cooptation, which happened, right? Where you've got particular expressions of Black Lives Matter, which again fit nicely within the context of the corporate world, right? So another good example of this, right? I mean, I love Kaepernick, and I supported Kaepernick in his stance. But what happens after Kaepernick gets booted from the NFL, right? He's picked up by Nike, and I'm glad it gave him a way to survive. But what does that say, right? It's like Nike didn't have a problem with his stance on an extreme problem, right? The problem of police killing of Black civilians, right? So it's kind of like that's something that we can all oppose and should all oppose. But there are other political stances that Black people are taking and have been taking over the last few months, which aren't co-opted or embraced by the corporate world in the same ways, right? So, many Black people who are in the so-called essential workers category, right? People who continue to work in, in the food service industry,
Mm-hmm.
who are in the production of livestock and other food supplies, people who are in the delivery, right, and shipping dimensions, gig economy folks who are working for Instacart and all these other companies. A lot of them said, we're not being protected in the midst of this pandemic. We don't have basic safety equipment. We don't have, we're not being paid adequately. We should get more money for this. And so some of them began organizing strikes and walkouts and circulating petitions. Those organizers got fired, right? So you can see in that case, same, we're still talking about Black people in many cases, but their demands don't square with what the central logics of capital actually are, right? Which is they don't
Mm-hmm.
those demands are against. They actually cut into the kind of profit making that these corporations, exist for, right? So I think that's where we can see where, how do you stop something from being co-opted, right? You make demands which don't necessarily square as easily with the central logics of capital. That would be my sense of it. But I mean, a lot of people, when I wrote that piece, there were people who rejected it on the grounds that, well, this is always going to happen, and that there's something else that's going on here that's more substantial on the ground, and it hasn't been co-opted, right? And so, there's been a few friends of mine have made that argument to me. I've seen a few other people respond on social media with the same kind of sentiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's true up to a point, right? There are things that are happening on the ground which have nothing to do with the corporate
Oh yeah.
britons, right?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
campaigns locally where people are pushing for real reforms, right? So I'm not denying that, but I just think that it does matter though, right? Because the money is gonna shape some behaviors, and it's gonna shape certain organizations going forward, whether we like to think about that or not, right? I mean, it is going to set the agenda as far as what Black Lives Matter might mean, or anti-racism is going to mean in concrete terms, both within the corporate world, but also within civil rights organizations, anti-policing organizations, and campaigns locally. But I think that's a real fear about being co-opted. I just think that there's some things that are more difficult to be co-opted, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of why, and keep pushing for those things, right? Things that the front office and the corporate world really does not want. Those should be our demands.
It's interesting that you say that. When all this happened, where I work, and I don't know if I told you, I actually work with the unhoused population here in Oakland, California, actually kind of the whole Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
We have emergency shelters here through a program that our Governor Gavin Newsom rolled out, where we have these vacant hotels, and we house a certain segment of the homeless population in these vacant hotels.
Mm-hmm.
But we had these Zoom meetings about I don't even know what to call them, kind of like racial talks, I would say, in the same vein of what's her name's book, White Fragility.
Oh yeah.
Like we
Yeah.
like we had White Fragility Zoom meetings,
Right.
and my boss is like, she came to me, she goes, if you want to join one of these, you can. And I was like, are you sure you want me on there? And she was like, if you want to be. And it kind of were almost like pity parties.
Yeah.
And I had to quickly get in there and change the conversation to a conversation about, power structures and class.
Mm-hmm.
because kind of the thing that you'll hear, and we had like six of them or so, and I joined on like two, but one of the kind of themes that was a through line of them was like, we need more people of color in upper management.
Right.
And my thing was, that's fine, but what if that person of color has the same belief system as the white person that was oppressing you,
Right.
i.e., an Obama presidency? You had an Obama presidency and a black DOJ, and none of these cops that killed these kids got prosecuted,
Right.
and we didn't get our Obama prize after 8 years. So,
Right. Right.
so what does it matter the color of the foot in the boot on your neck?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
What is your take on this kind of like corporate takeover of the racial conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's what they do, right? And we could go back, if we rewound all the way back to Black Power, right? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
where the response we're seeing now was rehearsed and workshopped, right? It was companies like Kodak, in Rochester. I lived in Rochester, New York for 10 years, and Kodak
Mm-hmm.
still looms large, even though they've hollowed out most of their production, in Rochester. But that company, one of the things they did after the 64 riots, right? Rochester was one of the first cities to riot, right? Back in
Mm-hmm.
the 50s. They started moving in the direction of all of these things, you just alluded to, right? Hiring more black scientists and technocrats, hiring a few middle managers. They also did things like engage in like vocational and technical training, job training for working class blacks. But the response was, let's try to bring these people into what already exists. Let's not change what we do ultimately, but let's just try to integrate. And I mean, I think we're seeing that again now. What I'm worried about is, there's always these moments where, I'm glad you brought up Obama, where, you try to be the critical voice, and then people push back against it by saying, well, wait a minute, brother, this moment is going to give rise to what we've all been waiting for, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
was in my 20s in the 90s, right? And I participated in anti-globalization protests in DC, the April 26th demonstrations back in 2000, actually. And I remember saying that to other people, like, this is the beginning of something important, and you should dial down your criticism. I had a back and forth with my graduate advisor back then about this, and people always say that, right? There's kind of like the politics of hope, right? The sort of optimism
Mm-hmm.
of the will, when we should also be maintaining some pessimism of the intellect, right? And I think it repeats itself, right? So then again, back during the Occupy demonstrations, it was the same sort of thing. It was like, you criticize it too harshly, folks push back and say, wait a minute, this is actually going to be important, and let's not try to suffocate it with criticism. And that didn't necessarily give rise to the kinds of durable changes that many people were anticipating. Obama, same thing, right? It was like when he was being elected, it was impossible to criticize him for his record and his actual stances, because so many people had invested in him as a personality, almost like a messianic figure, and were just
Mm-hmm.
unwilling. They were unwilling to have any conversation about what this was going to mean, long term. And I think we're back in that same space, right? And it's the disconnect between what we do on a day to day basis to try to build power versus a sense of historical change that's disconnected from that, right? A sense of historical change that assumes that there'll be some catastrophic event, some rupture in the ordinary operating of day to day life, and that'll create the space that we need in order to advance and transform the society in more just ways. And it just doesn't work like that, right? It's day to day grind, that has to happen as far as building capacity in
Mm-hmm.
organizations, and really getting to the place where we have the organizations in place that can contest those in power, right? And that takes time, right? It's not an overnight thing. So I think that's one of the problems in this moment, right? Everybody's hoping that this is it was even worse last month, right? I mean, it was like everybody imagined that we were on the verge of, major, massive reforms. And people are still saying that. Like, I definitely know friends and others who are still saying that. But when I look around, I'm down here in Louisiana right now, people are still going to Walmart. Folks are still going about their business.
Mm-hmm.
The oil, petrochemical industry is still rolling. A lot of people have moved on. Like, it was transformative for some. It was an outburst of protest, and it was probably cathartic for a lot of people. But life as it is has kind of went back to normal. And that's where we should actually be doing the work of building support for a different kind of United States or a different kind of world, right? It's this moment sort of after the big party is over that
Mm-hmm.
you got to do the work, to get where we want to go. And I think it gets lost in these moments, man. People really don't want to talk about, things critically, or even acknowledge a lot of the fact that what we saw last month was many different things going on at once. It wasn't just Black Lives Matter. It was all sorts of other um, social forces that were unleashed by the George Floyd murder, right?
I think George Floyd, this is just my opinion. And I think I heard you say this, and I started jumping up and down because I was like, I've been saying the same shit. This motherfucker done got on TV and stole my shit. You had made a comment on one of the shows you were on and said you think that some of this, and I might be quoting you wrong. I'm not quoting. I hope I'm not misinterpreting this. Was a backlash to Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And I really felt like, because this isn't the first time we've seen people get murdered by the police,
Right.
on live TV.
Right.
It's happened. We literally saw 2 years prior. Was it 2 years or 3 years prior? Philando Castile got shot on Facebook Live,
right,
in front of his girl and kid.
right.
Died on Facebook Live
Yeah.
in the same state where they choked that man out.
Yep.
And what made that so crazy to me was, here you have in a place where we love our Second Amendment right? The one sacrosanct amendment is the damn Second Amendment.
Right.
And here this man goes, says, hey, officer, I have a concealed carry permit.
Right. Right.
And he gets smoked for literally having the right documentation to carry a firearm legally. And we didn't have the same blow up.
Right.
And I think without Trump being Trump, you don't get this level of blow up.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it was a couple of different things going on, right? So, and this is, I'm not fully committed to this particular interpretation, right? I'm kind of still trying to figure it out. I mean, one friend of mine said that a lot of this was about the shelter in place for some people, right? It was like,
that
where
too.
we got the permission to be out in the streets, right? And I've even heard people, one friend of mine described a protest in Detroit as like it was more of a social gathering. I mean, and all protests kind of have that dimension to them, but it was like, again, we had the permission after being pent up for 90 days in some cases. All of a sudden, there's this moment where we're able to break with the with what we had been enduring for so long. I mean, I think a lot of it was opposition to Trump. It was a kind of opposition to Trump that was somewhat indirect, right? I mean, we know that he is racist, right? He rode into office on all kinds of racist overtures, and so it was definitely a rejection of him and his administration. I think it was also it was also in a way, when you look at the kind of looting that happened, man, I mean, it went beyond in scale anything that we've seen before, right? This wasn't just,
Mm-hmm.
Black people in Black neighborhoods, burning up the main commercial strip. But this was like people looting major commercial, wealthy
They
places.
stole
Right?
cars where I am, man. They went
Yeah,
to the car dealership and stole cars.
absolutely, man. I mean, there were malls out in Chicago that were looted, like smash and grab style. People
Mm-hmm.
pulling up with like 30 cars, and then everybody runs in, and downtown. I mean, the most, downtowns across the country were looted, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
the Chicago Loop. Um, I was watching video one night. I just ended up just binging television, maybe 24 hours, nonstop, day after day. And I was watching these guys loot the Third Street Promenade in Santa Monica. Man, it was just like, somewhat surreal. Like when
Yeah.
some white guys rode up on a moped and came out with surfboards. It was like it was a free for all.
I know which video you're talking about.
And then they cut to like Rodeo Drive, and it was more the same, man. It was unbelievable to see, the looting stretch to those places. And I think, drugstores being looted, right? People walking out with literally with prescription drugs and toilet paper, right? So it was a different phenomenon than what we've seen in the past. And I think I I'm still trying to make sense of it, but I do think it's more than Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think that was the ignition, or the match, but there was all sorts of other things that were going on, and there were also some fairly superficial things that were happening as well, right? So on the one hand, there's the faithful, right? There's the Black Lives Matter activists, those of us, not even just Black Lives Matter, but people who've been fighting against anti-policing, fighting against policing and mass incarceration for decades now, man. I tell people all the time, when I was 19 here in Louisiana, I was already taking, younger kids to go to the prison and meet with gang members. We met with one guy this one time who was actually from Los Angeles, who had gotten in prison
Mm-hmm.
for bringing drugs back and forth. That was when I was 19, right? So this was like 1990, something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing that stuff. My oldest kid is 22. I'm holding him on my shoulders, protesting Amadou Diallo's killing, right, in New York
Wow.
when he was a kid, right? He was a baby. He
Mm-hmm.
probably was like maybe 1 or 2 years old. So this has been around for a long time. I think so. We represent one dimension of all of this: the people who see the issue clearly and who took to the streets because, again, we've had enough of this. Right? We had enough of seeing this happen. But there are all sorts of other folks who are out there. For them, it was a revelation, right? It's folks who are like just coming to to the conclusion that this is a problem in the country. I think some people did it, and this is not necessarily a condemnation, but they did it because their friends were doing it, right? They may not have even had
Mm-hmm. I agree.
fully formed opinion about it, but just curiosity. It was like peer pressure. It was social media, Instagram worthy, as far as a moment. So I think we got to disentangle all that, right? Because, anytime there's some sort of social event on that scale, we can't reduce it to like one thing or one or two things, right? I mean, I think we really gotta open it up. And that's why we end up with Black Lives Matter activists who've been saying openly over the last few weeks that they feel like the narrative has gotten out of their hands, right? That other people have taken over. In Minneapolis, you had activists who were complaining about whites showing up who they didn't know, and people who they feared might have been undercover police, and some of that was true, right, in different places. But I think even Black Lives Matter core activists saw that this thing was bigger than anything that they had organized before, right, in some of these cities, and that there were other social forces at play. Which, again, like you said, a lot of it had to do with opposition to Trump, even if it was in indirect ways, And I think a lot of it was about anxiety and the sense of uncertainty about this pandemic, right? I saw one person on television make this point that maybe because of the conditions of the pandemic, um, this was the Brooklyn borough president. Because of the conditions of the pandemic, many Americans could identify with George Floyd, right? The uncertainty,
That's an
fact of their
interesting
own
point.
mortality, the fact of
Yeah.
unemployment, all of those things were very much present in people's minds, and you know, they could identify with him, right? And we were all kind of at homebound. That's the other thing too. So we're watching television and keeping up on social media, so it resonates in a different way than it would have had we been, working and going to the bar and doing other things and been distracted. So I think you're absolutely right. It's the time of Trump that contributed a lot to how this thing unfolded.
Do you see coronavirus as a black problem? Because I know there was an article, I can't remember who published it, but it was about Chicago
Mm-hmm.
and the rate of coronavirus and the way it's attacking the black community in Chicago. Is it a black problem there, or is it a poor, more people have to live on top of each other in one house problem? Or is it both?
Right. I mean, I think it's both. I think the piece, or at least one piece that comes to my mind was Kianga Yamada Taylor
That's the one.
did a piece in the New York Times, and she described it as a black plague.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I thought that was. I mean, I agree with her in general, right? That it did affect. How can you disagree? It did affect black people in disproportionate ways. Um, I think some of that had to do with the first wave and where the cities that the virus was introduced into the country in, right? The biggest, hit the
Mm-hmm.
metropolitan centers first, and the density matters, the pre-existing conditions, and people have already talked about this, that folks were suffering from mattered in terms of who got it and who had more severe responses to it, right? And then, but I think that's going to change. It's already changed in some states, right? As the virus has spread beyond those initial um, counties or jurisdictions where it started, it's hitting working class and poor populations in the same ways, right? And I mean, this is the problem with the strict race discourse that we use. We lop all whites together, and we forget that if we talk about whites as whites, then numbers are always going to be skewed by extraordinarily wealthy people, right? And the conditions that they live under. And so you end up with a perception of what white people enjoy, which is, disproportionately affected by only a small number of very, very wealthy white families, and elites, the 1% that we talked about back, during the Occupy
Yep.
demonstrations. And then on the flip side, if we lop all blacks together, we got to include people who are barely surviving, within that same, like you said, the same folks you're talking about and working with on a
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day basis, who don't even have a place to live, along with people who are wealthy. They may not be as wealthy as that full 1%, the top echelons of the 1%, but there are black wealthy people across the country. I mean, I think people lose
Yes, there
sight of
is.
that. Yeah, people lose sight of that. But that's where, we end up being a little bit too simple in terms of thinking about the continuities and the commonalities that a lot of black and white people experience, and Latinos and other folks across the country. But I just think the Black Plague argument, it resonates in a certain way, right? Just like Black Lives Matter, just
Mm-hmm.
like the new Jim Crow. We know that, right? We know that story very well. Um, and so it's tough to refute, right? I mean, this country was born and founded on chattel slavery, and and it's taken a long time to get to where we are now. So there's no denying that narrative, but I just think that to talk about the contemporary coronavirus as simply a black problem it just doesn't square. It's too soon. It was too soon of an argument to make, and it doesn't square with what this virus looks like outside of New Orleans, Chicago, and the Bronx, right? So I just think
Yeah.
I think we're really going to see it. Unfortunately for a lot of people, after Memorial Day weekend, after
Ooh.
July 4th weekend, now we're going to really start to see, and this is another part, because so many people, this is becoming an ideological thing where you've got a lot of people in the hinterlands of the country, who they don't believe the science. They think that not wearing a mask is somehow a live free or die type statement. Like
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they don't want to listen to authority. And there's an anti urbanism, there's an anti uh blackness dimension to it. There's people who don't give a damn about other folks who they encounter in Publix. Whereas if you live in a city, you know that we're all interdependent, right? That what happens on this block is gonna matter to somebody else, right? I think there's a little bit more of an acceptance of that within the Bay Area, New York,
Mm-hmm.
Chicago, some of these places. But in some of these smaller towns and other places, there's already resentment towards cities. There's already the view that cities are the space of black and brown people and folks who don't deserve anything. And so they're not willing to go along with this kind of collaborative or collective um, action that we need, which is that we all wear masks, we all social distance, we all limit the amount of time that we're in public. So there's a way that I think the racial politics plays out in that way, and there's also maybe a way that commitments to capitalism are going to doom a lot of folks over the next 4 months, next few months. So yeah, I don't know. It's not a black plague. I think, but when it's all said and done, those numbers are going to level out in some ways.
I mean, it's been tearing up the Native community as well.
Right.
Uh,
Absolutely.
and down here, there was an article in one of our local papers where they were doing testing in the Mission District of San Francisco, which historically is a majority Latino area.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that 90%, 90% of the people that got it were Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and 95% were essential workers.
Right.
So, I think there's more of a theme of it tearing up a certain economic strata.
Right.
Um,
folks, I mean, think about it like this. If somebody has symptoms, one, the symptoms could be mild, or they could be,
mm-hmm.
So you come home from work or whatever, you assume that you don't have anything, especially during those early months when there's like limited information, there's misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Also this claim going around. I don't know if this was on the West Coast so much, but this claim I heard early on that black people couldn't get it. Right? Yeah, people.
I heard, yeah, I heard that
So
too.
you can imagine, like, I don't know. I mean, then there's all sorts of stuff going on, man. There's also like masculinist type shit where people are not wearing masks because they don't want to, because they like figure they're not going to get it. It's not, manly or whatever to wear a mask and whatever else. So there's all kinds of weird ways that people are navigating this, man, that I think is detrimental, and I don't know. And when you have, again, somebody in the White House who refuses to wear one as well, it just doesn't help. But yeah, I think it is, again, people who uninsured, folks who have lived with health problems already, for a long time, they're gonna feel it in ways that, that's a class thing, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to not have those protections. And I think in the end, it's tough to talk about it now, but in the end, I think it will be clear that that it disproportionately affected working class people and the poorest and most vulnerable across ethnic and racial lines.
Speaking of racial lines, I just started reading Black Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
Very dense read,
Right.
to say the least. There's a term that I'm seeing get used a lot more, racial capitalism.
Right.
Could you give a brief explanation, super lay explanation, doesn't have to be fancified,
Mm-hmm.
of of what that is?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess the way that it's used, let me talk about how it's used by academics, by activists increasingly nowadays, right? It's really
Thank
used
you.
to say that when we think about capitalism in this moment and we think about it historically, that we can't separate it from processes of racialization and and racism in society, right? But that they tend to work together, right? There's a lot of times you hear people use, there's a quote from Malcolm X, where he says that you can't have capitalism without racism, right? So that quote is cherry picked, but it's used over and over again by different people, and it's consonant with this notion of racial capitalism. Let me say a little bit more about where it comes from and why I think it's more of it operates now more as a way of trying to bring together the kind of anti-racist politics that has been powerful and influential during this Black Lives Matter period, trying to
Mm-hmm.
bring that in together with an anti-capitalist politics. And there's a part of me that doesn't really, I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but typically when I hear people talk about these things, at least the circles, maybe I'm in the wrong circles, it's usually still stronger on the racial part than the capitalism part, right? As far as a
Mm-hmm.
sophisticated, and not just sophisticated, but useful analysis of capitalism. So it comes from, even before Cedric Robinson, it comes out of debates in the South African left during apartheid, right? And so you have a few mainly South African Communist Party folks who are making the case that South Africa is a particular kind of manifestation of capitalism, that it is I guess the phrase people use sometimes is that it's a colonialism of a special type. And so their notion of it is that concept speaks to South African conditions where I mean, clearly you had apartheid, you had a superordinate or dominant Afrikaner, settler class in the country. And so it makes sense in some ways to talk about the unique racial character of capitalism in South Africa during the 1960s and 70s, what that looks like. So that's where it comes from. Now there were it's important to remember that there were people who didn't accept that as an idea, right? They just simply,
Really?
yeah, there was some South African communists who debated these things and rejected it. So but I think the way that Robinson picks it up is interesting, right? So Robinson uses it, and there's a good article by UCLA professor Peter James Hudson that kind of lays out this background. But he makes the case that the South African communists use racial capitalism to talk about something specific and historical, South Africa under apartheid, right? Whereas Robinson uses, and I think a lot of people who follow in his wake, to talk about capitalism globally, right? And to make this argument, this is the way capitalism functions throughout the different hemispheres, but also over time, right? And I think Robinson, I was a fan of Robinson and still am in some ways, the things that he wrote for Race and Class, the British Journal, back during the 90s. There's some great pieces that he wrote that I loved as a grad student. They were really helpful for me in terms of thinking about Black political thought and, culture and what have you. But really good piece he did. If you're interested in this sort of stuff on blaxploitation films that, I still teach to this day. But Robinson, to me, he comes upon, or he sort of introduces this idea of racial capitalism as a corrective to Marx and Engels, and I think it's a corrective that we didn't really need. Right? It actually, in the process, um, diminishes the ways that both Marx and Engels did acknowledge that capitalism was not separate from racial prejudice and the kinds of things that we might assume. So he in Black Marxism, I don't know if you've gotten to this part yet, but he undertakes a reading of the Communist Manifesto that I think is both it's a selective reading of Marx and Engels, and it's a poor reading of Marx and Engels, right? And most people who are using the term racial capitalism could care less about that reading, but I think it says a lot about how the term is introduced into U.S. discussions, right? And the kinds of conversations we're having now. So, those passages in the manifesto where Marx and Engels are almost sounding like they're praising capitalism, right? They're talking about how capitalism will sweep aside like all of these, backwards historical norms and cultural practices, superstitions. It'll batter down all Chinese walls. They use that sort of language. And what they're doing, right? I mean, they're basically saying that as a historical phenomenon, right? Capitalism is new, it's changing things, it has some progressive aspects, and that it's setting the stage for, perhaps, what they want, which is something even better, right? And when they write about that, they're talking about those things in, I think, a speculative way, right? So they're talking about what capital can do, right? What this process of the production of surplus value, what it can do when it's introduced in certain places, right? And you can read that stuff and say they're speculating, they're anticipating what could happen, but they're not saying that this is what's going to happen, right? And there's more contingency to what they're saying. And I think Robinson reads it as though it's not just speculative, but rather it's predictive. That they're saying that this is what's going to happen. Capitalism is going to unfold, and prejudice and these other things are going to be swept aside, right? And not only does it not happen, but then Robinson uses that fact that it hadn't happened to set up this idea about racial capitalism. I think it's unfair to Marx and Engels, right? I mean, Marx wrote extensively about American slavery, right? He wasn't somebody who didn't think that this was a part of the system and the process that he was critiquing, right, criticizing. So I think it's a bad reading, but it's the bad reading that sets up this idea that somehow racial capitalism is the way that we should think about our world, right? The other thing, I'll probably end it on this one. I mean, that's a false idea, right? That somehow, as we said at the very beginning of the show, it's sort of a false idea that there's a problem that we can't have a capitalist economy without racism, right? This is kind of a false notion, right? I mean, like I said, as we said earlier, corporations are all on board with a particular kind of anti-racism, right? They're all over it. We saw, last month, and we could say, oh, well, it's just superficial, and maybe it is, but they can embrace that, right? And to be honest, it's not like Black people can't be capitalists, right? It's not like Black people can't participate in this economy and in this particular process of profit making, like everyone else. There's parts of this world where there are very few white people where capitalism thrives, right? So the idea that somehow it's something that has to exist alongside deep racial conflicts is an overstatement, right? I mean, I think again, I'm all in favor of talking about the ways that race and capitalism work together, right? In certain moments, but I don't think it's as cut and dry as some of the folks who are using racial capitalism might might assume. It also, maybe this is more importantly, as far as my experiences of how it's being used. Most people who talk about racial capitalism don't necessarily want to get into a conversation about black capitalism. They see that as somehow an exception. Um, and I think we have to bring that in as well, right?
Speaking of black capitalism, one of our most famous black capitalists and fellow Chicagoan, Kanye West, has somehow, I don't even want to say thrown his name in the presidential campaign. I think he just kind of caused a stir, as only Kanye can do. I am a fan of his music. I definitely really dug it when Katrina hit, and George Bush doesn't like black people.
Yeah.
Like that felt real honest. Looking at the responses of the people around him, were like, wow, you said that.
Right.
His music, in my opinion, has definitely pushed the genre, sonically and also content wise.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think he is kind of the personification of race and class. Like, hey, just because you're black don't mean that you understand the working class when you get to a certain level.
Right.
At $1 billion. What was your take when you saw all that attention just recently in the press about him saying he wants to be president?
Yeah, I mean, that guy, I guess I'm also, I've also been a fan of his for a long time. I mean, I think for me, um, his album, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, right, was probably,
Mm-hmm.
I won't say that's when he falls off, but for me, that was one of his last full albums that I was like, I could get behind. I mean, he's done other things that I've liked, but I just think, it's one of the problems of power, right? And of having a big platform. We've seen it both within the context of the presidency, but we see it all the time with celebrities. These people are given, and there's a lot of this in Marx, right? Once you have this money power, right, it kind of transforms you. You could be a dummy, but now you get to command and
Mm-hmm.
it empowers, right? It has like powers that
Mm-hmm.
are almost magical. So he's able to have a big platform, and he's not prepared for it, right? There are people who are you know toiling away in total anonymity, right? In some church or community organization who have a lot more to say about the world and a lot more sense than he does, but he's able to, to have this platform, right? And I think, as a society, we support that, right? We like the train wreck. It's entertaining to us to watch somebody, you know, um, and it's odd because what he's known for and what he's actually good at, which is making music, doesn't necessarily mean that he has anything important to say about the political world, but because
Yes.
we've come to think of the presidency as just another type of celebrity, right? That it allows him and others to aspire to that. I mean, you could think about it, just over. You all have had a movie star as governor, other places
Yeah.
have had,
And president. Yeah, he was governor.
right.
We had Reagan. Yeah.
So yeah, actors. So I think for a long time now we've been veering in that direction where we don't think about national political leaders as being that much different from celebrities. I mean, even Obama, right? I mean, a lot of people were enamored by him in the same ways they would be with a rock star, right? They didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
They could care less about his political views, And if anything, were irritated if you want to talk about that stuff, right? They liked the optics of it, right? That he was a charismatic guy, that he had an interesting life, that he had a beautiful family, and he filled a void that they had, right? In some ways. So I think it's sad that that's where we are, right? We don't even equate national political leadership with anything else but celebrity. But I don't know, man. That guy, I worry about him. And I don't think, as people always say, that it's a situation where it's after his mom died, he lost his. I think he's always probably struggled. You know what I mean? And maybe the fact of his mom and other social supports kind of gave him, uh, some guidance, some direction.
Perspective, maybe.
Yeah, maybe so. But I think, that's a tough role to be in. I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to him, because I think when you get thrust into that level of celebrity also, right? I mean, it usually doesn't end that well for a lot of people. There's all sorts of stories we could tell of people who, it's a lot of pressure. And
Yeah.
the money doesn't change that in some ways, right? It actually might be worse for some. Yeah.
It can to your point. I think it definitely can justify the wrong or unintelligent things that one may say when they have tons of money. I mean, listening to rich people talk at like Davos, I'm always underwhelmed. Like, wow, you said that,
right?
Especially when it comes to any question of taxes.
Right. That's not something. That's what I was thinking about earlier when you mentioned the kind of white fragility discussions, right? It's rare. I mean, where's the discussion about sharing? You know what I mean?
It's so funny when we were having these conversations. Right? Oh man, we were having these conversations on the Zoom thing, and it gets to be about people of color complaining about maltreatment, or people that are adjacent to people of color talking about like discrimination and police fear. And I heard Adolph Reed Jr. say today, he goes, I don't know too many black people that wake up in the morning that are literally afraid of the police, right, like when they go out and about their day. And there's some truth to that. Like, I'm way more afraid of the bill collector than I am the police.
Right.
The repo man is who I'm looking out for, not the police.
Right.
Especially where I live here in Oakland, where they really don't bother me. It's trying to get that conversation away from that whole like, well, this is how you have to be around these types of people, and we're going to hire more black people, and Netflix showing me black movies first.
Right.
Like, we have to get back to the conversation about these systems that create oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the first questions I had asked you when you said what you want to talk about. And I'm sorry it took me so long to get to this, but how do we start to build a strong black left,
mm-hmm,
and reconnect ourselves even with our black socialist roots?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's a bigger problem of socialism in the US right now, right? That it's been taken off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's exciting to me, somebody who's a socialist. I think it's exciting to see like the way in which that is no longer a pejorative, right? It's no longer a bad word in many circles, because there are people who've grown up now who have no memory, no experience of the Cold War, right? So
yeah, I haven't seen Rocky IV.
Yeah. Right. No, they have not, or Red Dawn.
Or Red Dawn. I cry every time I watch Red Dawn at the same scene. When he goes sees his dad in the camp, in the re-education camp.
Yeah.
Avenge me. I tear up. I'm not gonna lie, man.
Yeah, so they haven't seen any of that or all the Vietnam War, movies. Or if they see it, it's out of context. It doesn't have the same ideological power it had back, in the 70s and 80s. So I think that's, I was mentioning this to somebody recently. I just really I really think that's a major thing, right, in our moment, right, that you can have people running for city council seats as socialists and winning,
Mm-hmm.
right, or have Sanders, mount a viable campaign nationally and really sort of garner a lot of support, even though it wasn't enough. So I just think I think it was an exciting moment, but there's still a problem, right? In that once you get outside of the places that you and I live in, where it does feel like that's a possibility, where there's organizations, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
sort of left and socialist organizations. You got reproductive justice movements going, that's in motion. You've got Black Lives Matter, teachers unions that are organizing, other kind of trade union activity, right? It feels different. It feels like there's traction for some of those ideas. The kinds of conversations you can have with people are different than in other parts of the country. As you know, Louisiana, right? You're not going
Mm-hmm.
to find the
Mm-hmm.
same infrastructure of the left, right? You're not going to find the same discussions about things, right? And it's not that people are uh, less concerned or that they're totally against, some of those ideas, that there's sort of a natural predisposition to be against them. It's just, I think the lives of folks and the politics is more grounded in day to day, real shit, right? And I think that's if we're going to try to build black, support among black people for a socialist politics, it's got to start there, right? It's got to start with people's real needs, and that might not even involve talking about socialism, right? It's not,
Yeah.
a study group might not be the place to start, right? It might be starting with campaigns for policies that you can actually win in a state. You know what I'm saying? So, like, whether that's raising the minimum wage, which I know people get pissed off when you talk about basic things, but usually when I hear somebody get pissed off about social democracy or welfare, politics, policies, it's usually somebody who doesn't need them. It's usually somebody who's not struggling, right? So I have an impatience for that, man. I mean, we saw, like, with the, just using the Sanders example again, Sanders didn't do well in
I was just
Southern,
about to ask you that. Yeah.
yeah, with Southern blacks, and that's something we need to face, right? I don't think it's that, when you look at national polls of black voters, they tend to be the ones most likely to support. We tend to be the ones most likely to support Medicare for all, most likely to support single payer health care and other progressive social policies. But I think in those states like South Carolina and Louisiana and the old Black Belt South, people are fighting regular battles, day to day struggles that you got to start somewhere else, right? You got to start with things that might not be as sexy to folks, in the coastal and metropolitan left, but
Mm-hmm.
they may actually build capacity and build support, as well as change people's sense of what's possible, right? I mean, I think, if you think about it like this, man, I mean, you probably had this experience too, where you're on the losing team, right? You've been you've been on the losing team all season,
Yeah.
beating somebody where you have no chance of going to the playoffs is going to feel better, right? You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
The winning team,
That's your Super Bowl. Yep. Yep.
right? So I think some, in some places in the in the South, that's really the experience. Is like, if you're in a place like Mississippi, where, or Alabama, where you've got definitely some black population clusters in certain places, but then you've got Republican, you might be outnumbered by white Republicans, in some places. So you got to think about that strategically. And I think if we could succeed in building support for socialist politics, in those kinds of places, that's when you begin to see the country sort of tilt in a different direction. I think, it's not enough to have a again, the most populous parts of the country, the most urbane parts of the country, um, in support of these things. But we really got to figure out strategies to try to connect with people. Large portion of the Black population is in the South. And so we need to think about that, seriously. I think the way to connect it is really through public goods, and maybe a project of trying to decommodify um, basic needs, that we all have, right? So, trying to find ways to decommodify housing, whether that's through rent controls, state support for cooperative housing, social housing, all of those things that have worked historically, right? Um, Pushing for those kinds of alternatives in cities and also in these places, like the South where people really need them. Folks are struggling with high levels of poverty and fighting through affordable housing crises, right? In some of these places like New Orleans, right? It's tough to find a decent house that'll allow you to be able to get to work and back um, on a regular basis, and not or have a house that doesn't put you in harm's way where you're worried about real crime. So I think all of those things, like a public goods oriented politics could push us more in a direction of a real socialist majority in the country. But we gotta start with Black working class people, Latinos, and other folks who aren't represented in some of the socialist, sort of formal socialist organizations that we have right now.
And I feel definitely not. And I feel like another problem was, if you remember when Bernie was really gaining steam, like kind of right before that Super Tuesday, where the Democratic Party just showed and flexed real hard.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the conversation going up to that Super Tuesday started to change from Bernie's winning these states with no media attention whatsoever to he just doesn't have the Black vote because he doesn't know how to talk to Black people.
Right.
And then all these Black people started chiming in on the big time news networks talking about how Bernie Sanders is just disconnected from the Black community.
Right.
And then I kept thinking to myself, well, every time these people start talking about reparations, the first thing they say is, well, what we need college free.
Right.
What we need healthcare free for Black people.
Right.
I'm like, okay, I dig it, but isn't that dude's platform?
Right.
Yep. Like, why did those issues stop being quote unquote Black issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think there still are Black issues. I just think it's the Black
right?
people who have control of the microphone, right? And
copy that.
Yeah, and I think their continued control of the microphone depends on reminding everyone that Black people's politics are dissimilar from the rest of the population, right? I think that's maybe one of the problems, right? You've got a Black punditry or commentariat, which really relies on, a politics of difference, right? That there has to be something distinct about Black people that, that permits them or it enables them to make the case. I think another thing too, right, aside from the pundits, there's some politicians who have a vested stake in not supporting like the kinds of universal politics that Sanders was pushing. I mean, the biggest name that comes to mind is James Clyburn in South Carolina.
South Carolina, yeah.
He actually has received more money from the pharmaceutical companies than any other congressperson, right, over a course of a decade. And so I think, it's clear why he's an opponent, right, and why he went on the trail twice, stumping for Hillary Clinton and then again for Biden, and really appealing to Black South Carolinians' fears about another Trump presidency, right? About the first time around, by casting doubt on the possibility of universal public policies and relying on some, sort of shady red baiting, and really drawing on fiscal conservative language. Things like nothing in life is free. Nobody wants a free lunch. Like that was a sort of language that um, Clyburn, John Lewis, Cedric Richmond, these other folks who were deployed around the state as surrogates for the party establishment. That was essentially what they were claiming, right? Was that, Sanders doesn't have a chance in hell of winning. And even if he does, this stuff is not going to happen. So you shouldn't support him, right? He also, I'd say this too, he also had, he criticized free higher education because he's very closely connected to some of the private black colleges in South Carolina. I think Claflin in particular. And there's the vested interest that Clyburn had in batting down, politics which may have possibly threatened his interests, even though he presents those as though they're those of all black people, right? So I just, it's frustrating, but it's the reality that we're facing, right? So I think there's the pundits who rely on, they rely on this kind of like black, white people or this, black people or that as their main shtick. And then there's also people like Clyburn who have real vested interests in fighting against a politics of a Sanders campaign, right? He really had, real concrete reasons to be against that, So, that's where we are. But I just think the only way you reverse that is by, again, fighting the fights that we can win, which they might not seem like full on socialist politics as is discussed in the study group, but I think it's important to build that capacity and build that support at the ground level. And you might actually, in the context of states and cities, you might actually be able to pull along some of the black politicians and the pundits if you're able to gain momentum for those kinds of things at the state and the local level, right? I think we're ways from being able to do it nationally, but there's definitely some states where you could win, and people have won significant, gains here and there.
Oh, I believe that wholeheartedly. I think, just the fight for 15 alone.
Right.
That pretty much radicalized my mom. She's a socialist. And that's her question all the time. When I tell her how she listens to the show, when I tell her I have a guest on, usually the first question is, are they a socialist? So
good question, right?
I think it's hilarious. That's the question
Right.
from my mom. And she wasn't a lifelong activist at all.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get radicalized, especially when you see people that are losing. To your point earlier, like if you work for Walmart, Target, Amazon, you losing.
Right.
And that's the population. I'm like, why is nobody trying to really talk to these cats?
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah, I
don't get it.
I just think, I think that's a tough thing though, right? It's tough to build, right? And I think it's easier to kind of go with the status quo, or to engage in a performative kind of politics, politics of speaking truth to power, or engaging in other kinds of like more symbolic things, like ripping down a Confederate
statue
monument. Yeah, those sorts of things. I'm not saying those things shouldn't happen, but that's easier. That's easier to do than building a majority to support something that goes against those in power, right?
Oh man, I got into it on one of those Facebook pages, Occupy Democrats or something,
right?
About renaming. It was when they were going to rename one of the bases. I think it was Fort Hood. There's talk about renaming Fort Hood because that's named after a Confederate general, and his older brother told me that that's a good thing. Like this is the movement in the right direction that we finally are getting. And I was like, yeah, I kind of was like your perspective. Like, yeah, it's cool, but it's I don't want it to deflect from bigger issues. You can call Fort Hood the Maya Angelou Center for Peace and Prosperity, and if you're still sending out drone bombs and killing innocent Yemeni kids, it
Right.
doesn't really matter what you call it.
Yeah.
It's
No,
like
it doesn't matter at all.
changing these names and ripping off these statues, as they're huge, right? I don't live in the South. I definitely lived there for a short time, but I don't live there now. And I do remember seeing the Robert E. Lee big ass statues in the middle of a downtown in a small southern city. Like, I hella remember that.
Yeah.
So I know it must be somewhat cathartic to tear that down, but that's not it.
Right.
You don't want to tear that down and be like, all right, we won. High fiving.
Yeah, then
Racism over.
you've got this weird thing happening as well, man, where a lot of people are defacing, statues that should stay, right? I saw where some people damaged the Massachusetts, 54th Regiment statue in Boston, right? The all colored regiment that was from the Civil War that was depicted in the film Glory. That one was defaced. There's also been demands to take down Lincoln statues,
Yeah, I saw
which
that.
is amazing. I mean, the one in DC, I think, was actually funded or paid for by free persons. There's a story of one woman who used her first $5 she ever got to put
Yeah.
down payment on this. And when I see stuff like that, I mean, it just makes me feel like an old man for sure. Even though I'm not quite 50 yet, but I think it just makes me feel like, what is this actually about, right? It's not about um, real historical interpretation for sure. It's about people's feelings, whatever those might be, or feelings of not being recognized, or maybe some other things that we're not even considering, right? But they have nothing to do with the actual history, right? Because if that's the case, you don't take down a statue that was financed by former slaves, right? I mean, that should be a no-no. But people are adamant about this, right? Even in other places, there's been demands to take down Lincoln's statue. I think at University of Wisconsin Madison.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, well, he wasn't. He emancipated slaves, but he was anti-black, right? And it's unfortunate, man. I mean, one of the buildings I work in, we have 3 buildings at UIC's campus, a cluster of classroom buildings that are called, they're named after the Civil War heroes, right? And it's like Lincoln, Douglas, and Grant, and, Grant's another person. His statues have been targeted, I think, in the Bay Area even, but it's amazing. I mean, like, to hear people talk about taking things down, I mean, I would actually probably oppose if that came to my campus, right, to try to change the names of those halls. I would probably oppose it, right? I know it'd be unpopular, and I'll probably be derided as somebody who's out of touch with the moment or whatever. But I just think it's silly, Confederate monuments, sure, get rid of those, right? Fascists, imperialists, take those away. But where's the sense of historical understanding, if that's what statues are supposed to be there for? We shouldn't just rush in and pull away statues without thinking about, or the names of buildings, without thinking about the history for what it was, right? It's not our moment, right? It was the moment that those people lived through, with its own limitations, with its own, contradictions that we can understand if we spend some time thinking about history, right? Who cares if Lincoln said some fucked up stuff about blacks or was in support of repatriation of blacks to Africa, if ultimately he did the work that was necessary for emancipation, right? I mean, I think that was one of his most important historical actions, right? And I think that, for me, it's useful because if we're going to win fights today, we need to have an equally sober view of people who are in power, right? That they're imperfect, that they're, as you pointed out earlier, that some of them they're not really that smart.
Mm-hmm.
But we need them to move in a different direction. And if we can do that, then we can build the kind of world that we want. But to sort of throw up our hands as though that's impossible, right? That Lincoln was a dickhead and therefore his statue should be taken down. That says something about how we think about politics in the present, right? There's a defeatist logic to it, right? That we can't win, we can't sway people who are not on our side now. I always tell students this when we talk about the major civil rights reforms. That stuff was passed in the 60s by people who you would not want to be in conversation with, right? You would not want to sit down with this person. They weren't pro-black. They were, some of these people were scoundrels. But because of the kinds of pressure that was brought to bear on them, both by the Southern desegregation campaigns, but also donors who got on the phone
Mm-hmm.
and called them and said, "Look, enough is enough. We got to stop this. Let's stop with the support for segregationists." And they had to move in a different direction. And I think we have to think about power in our own time in those ways, right? That is, people can be moved. Even folks who right now, just like we saw with Black Lives Matter, 5 years ago, there were a lot of Americans who didn't think it was true, right? That black people, even if they saw the video, they still didn't believe that
Yeah.
black people were disproportionately killed by police, more likely to be killed by police. Now, finally, as a result, there's a majority in support of that fact, right? People believe it as a fact. We got to have that sense, but I think the monuments battle, at least in part, reflects some really screwed up ways of thinking about politics that we need to correct if we're going to try to achieve some of the things that we want.
It's interesting about that because I think it goes back to the whole like people co-opting that moment. So as statues come down, I get more when I log onto my computer now. My YouTube has a whole thing about Black learning sessions,
Right.
learning about Black history or Black people taught by just random. I mean, you're not doing one of those classes, so it's definitely one of these like random, just a Black person
Right.
talking about Black people. It almost feels like disaster capitalism that Naomi Klein talks about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's take advantage of this moment and sell more Black stuff to actually non-Black people this time. So instead of the just for me commercials that we see during Soul Train,
Right.
it's like those commercials but aimed at white people.
Right. Oh man, I mean, you and I in the wrong line of work right now. You should be we should be white people whisperers or something like that, right?
You know what they really like? Mayonnaise. Give them Black people mayonnaise. They'll buy so much more. We'll put Famous Amos on a thing of some mayonnaise. I don't.
Yeah, man, it's bad. I think it's gonna be a brisk, commerce and that stuff for a while now. You know what I mean? Until it trails off or something else takes over. But I know
It's been,
in place,
yeah.
those books are gonna be flying off. They're gonna be flying off the shelves.
Have you read or did you ever check out or have you ever been on a panel with Ibrahim X Kendi that wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist?
I have not been on a panel with him, but I've been following his work for a while.
Did you like that compared to D'Angelo's book? Real quick, what did you think of that?
I mean, I guess it's not my thing, right? I don't think I'm not, here's the thing. I'm anti-racist, right? Actually, I don't think racism should be something that we support or that we encourage. I think is a problem and has been a problem in the society for a long time. I just don't see it as the way that we build again the kind of majority that we want. And that's not a concession to people who are backwards, right? I think people can learn in other ways, right? I think people can learn, through social struggles, whether they pick up, Ibram X Kendi's book and it might mean something different to somebody else than it's going to mean to me, right? Like it's not shaping my views and my path in a way it might a 19-year-old, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's been in denial about, the fact that their community's all white and there's one black guy one black kid at the high school, like that kind of. I think for some people, his work is appealing, right? And it may help them to think about the world differently. So I guess I'll just say that about him, and the entire slate of people who do that sort of work. But for my money, I think if we really want to get at the redistributive issues, we got to start somewhere else, right? And maybe his book has a role to play, and even his children's book that he just
Yeah, he did do a children's
published.
book.
Yeah, maybe those things have a role to play for some populations, but I just think we got to roll up our sleeves and get into the work. I think there's fights that are won. Like I said before with the national example, there are people who come to the side of the right side of history, who are not going to be fully anti-racist, but they're going to be people who learn through the process of participating in social struggles, right? And I think I'm not saying those two are completely separate, but I just think that that's a better laboratory or a better school than the sort of anti-racist literature, anti-racist approach. That's more about the study group and the conversations that people are having, and more of a therapeutic approach to it. I think that transformation can take place in politics and in social movements, and it might be more substantial, right? Like not dwelling in these high abstractions about race as something which has always permeated American society. But let's deal with what's going on locally in terms of you know um, prevailing wages, in terms of how do we create a police department that achieves public safety without all sorts of harassment, arrest of black people and other people who don't who haven't done anything. Um, how do we solve the problems that we all face in the places where we live?
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's a more difficult thing than talking about American history, learning about black people's history, binge watching Netflix, curated list on black cinema. Um, Again, those things are additive, right? Yeah, if people want to do that, that's their business. But ultimately, we got to get back to the work of how do we change the society. And I just don't know if I think the whole Kendi, Tim Wise,
White.
these other folks. It really,
Oh, Tim Wise.
I think that can be
Yeah.
like a diversion for some people. It could be a way to change what should be a collective project and a social and political project to one of personal concern, personal rehabilitation. Even though that stuff is couched in, oh, we're doing this because we want to change the society, it still can retreat into, like you said before, these kinds of pity parties and
Mm-hmm.
weepy discussions and confessionals. And I don't have any time for that, right? I don't want to deal with that sort of stuff. Um, Seriously, man, I just don't. I don't have time for that stuff, man. Deal with there's plenty of uh, paid professionals. If you want to talk about your what you did to somebody in the third grade, go do it with them, right? But don't bring that into what should be a space where we're thinking, right? We're thinking about how do we solve these problems that we face as a
Mm-hmm.
society, right? I think they're presented as though they're the same in some of this anti-racist, therapeutic discourse, but they're not the same, right? They're not the same at all. I gave this example to some people in an article I wrote years ago, and it didn't land for some. I mean, people came back at me and they're like, well, that's not the way the whole world works. But I was trying to show how local campaigns, local fights can unite people. It can change the way they think about the world. It can change their sense of possibility. And they don't have to foreground all of this kind of therapeutic shit, right? So the example I gave to folks is when I lived in Rochester, we had a huge problem with lead poisoning. And most of the kids who were being poisoned were black and brown kids, just because of the way the housing stock was in the city. The most rundown, older, dilapidated housing stock was also the ghetto, poorest parts of the cities. And so, this is where people were concentrated. They actually call that part of Rochester, because it kind of wrapped around the downtown. They called it the Fatal Crescent, because it was where a lot of the crime happened, and a lot of the homicides in particular. And so, people organized against lead poisoning, and the fight. This is two important, a couple of important points about this. The fight was, on the one hand, not a black and white fight, even though black people and brown people were disproportionately affected by the problem, right? But when you looked at the way the battle lines were drawn, on one side you had social workers, teachers, healthcare professionals, students, working class blacks and Latinos from the neighborhoods most affected, ministers on one side, the people who are trying to get some legislation passed. On the other side, you had the representative of the landlords and the politicians, who were also diverse, right? So there's diversity on both sides. So you can't really reduce it to like some sort of, us versus them, black white battle. And that's true for a lot of fights across the country, right? Whether you're talking about
police violence.
Yeah, you look around the room when you're in those hearings. There's black and white on both sides, right? So it kind of cancels out the older notions of thinking about black politics, right? Or this is the black people's concerns, right? So I think that's one issue that we could take away from it, one lesson. The other thing is that we didn't talk about anti-racism in those sessions that I attended. We talked about the problem that this was affecting kids, and black and brown kids. That was foregrounded, but there was no sense that you had to go through some sort of education before you could participate. And I think there's a lot of that happening right now, where it's like, before you can enter into political life, you have to rehabilitate. You've got to exercise whatever, privilege or whatever thing you have. And then once you're in the door, it's also this kind of hierarchical discussion about who gets to speak, right? And who
oh God, yeah,
chance to talk. And we're not going to take questions from this guy. We're going to reserve the time for underrepresented people. So there's this kind of well-meaning, I think, in the beginning, attention to people who've been locked out and excluded, but then it changes the character of the discussion, right? And in a political fight, what should matter most? Should it be that everybody who looks a certain way or comes from a certain background has a chance to speak? Maybe that matters in some context. Or is it that we figure out, again, how do we work together to actually achieve something? Now, in the case of this fight against lead poisoning, like I said, there were people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Some of those people I probably wouldn't have wanted to have a conversation with, right? And that's the nature of political life. You don't have to line up with somebody. You don't have to agree with them on all issues. We join together in certain fights with some people. We join together in other fights with other groups of people, right? And other individuals and other tendencies. So I think we got to get back to a sense of what the political world is like, how it functions, and the high abstractions that we're hearing about race, what black people want, what white people need to do, doesn't always make sense. It doesn't make sense when you're in real battles at the local level, right? And especially, again, not in, again, not to knock people on the coast, but in the metropolitan centers. But when you're in the trenches, in small towns, mid-sized cities like Rochester and other places where that stuff just doesn't fly. I mean, this is a good example to go along with that. Around the same time as that Rochester Lead Free Coalition was getting some momentum, and we actually did win in the end, right? That was around the same time as Occupy, and it was interesting to watch what Occupy meant in Oakland, what it meant in Manhattan, you know, and what it meant in Rochester. It meant nothing in Rochester, right? There was like a handful of people in this one park with tents. I mean, I'm talking about a handful. Like
Mm-hmm.
there was no massive congregation of people there, you know, with the talking microphones and all that. So nobody was doing that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I participated in a couple of sessions back then where you know, we did some labor related stuff, you know, in the context of what was going on, what seemed to be going on across the country. But I think Rochester was probably more typical of how most Americans experienced Occupy, which is that it didn't really matter to them. Maybe maybe they watched some of the news coverage. Maybe they heard about it indirectly from people they know who may have been on the coast or in bigger cities. But for most Americans, that didn't necessarily affect their lives in the ways that some of these local fights did, right? So I think the geography of it all matters and should matter to us, right? That you know, once we get down into the fight, the high abstractions, the grandstanding, and high abstractions, whether that's talking about race or whether it's talking about socialism, they're not going to mean the same to people who are trying to survive, who don't want their kid to be poisoned, right, and be basically disadvantaged for, you know, the rest of their lives in terms of education and other things that they're going to need to become independent. So, you know, to me, that was an instructive fight. I've been in others, but that one was really instructive because I didn't hear any of the stuff, any of the concerns as they were being articulated, you know, in this kind of national concern about Occupy and wealth inequality. But it was still the same issues, right? You know, it was still the same sort of battle, but just much more grounded. And I think we got
You,
to stay there. We got to stay there.
you know what? So we talked before about, you know, the South, and there was a term, and I worked in the Gulf of Mexico, and I had never spent a significant amount of time in the South until I worked in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a term that I almost got in a fight over until someone took me aside and told me what it meant, which was pretty hilarious. Coon ass.
Right, right.
So you can imagine, and for people listening that don't know, there's a term. It refers to like white cats
It does.
in southern Louisiana, and so I would be anywhere I would go, and cats would say, "Yeah, you got to watch out for them damn coon ass." Sound like a motherfucking coon ass.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
one day I was there for like my first 2 weeks. And mind you, if you don't know what an oil rig is, I think in the movie Armageddon they show you an oil rig. You're in this big metal box affixed to land in the middle of the ocean, and you're with very, very angry rednecks or
Republicans.
quote lot of Republicans of various colors. And there was definitely no Californians, trust me.
Yeah.
And so this one dude said something about coon ass, and I had enough. I like snapped. I was like, you know what? That's the last one I'm gonna take. I ain't gonna be. And they were like, and they stopped and they started cracking the fuck up.
You don't even know what we're talking about.
And this white dude goes, no, man, I'm a coon ass. And they all, so black, everybody was laughing.
Right.
But these quote unquote coon ass issues
Yeah.
were the same issues that I grew up hearing my
Oh
people
yeah.
say.
Yeah.
In the hood out here in the Bay and every other hood, you hear these same things in LA. You hear the same thing. Man, I'm tired of police fucking with me.
Right.
I'm tired of messing with me. You know, dudes that had hella baby mamas, they had warrants, they didn't have no driver's licenses, welfare recipients.
Right.
Anything you think about black people, it affected these white cats to the point where they used the same exact lingo that I was used to hearing here in the Bay Area.
Right.
When it came to getting fucked with by either the police or the district attorney, you name it.
Right.
And that's when I started to go, oh, this is like a class thing, huh? And a lot of black cats don't like to hear that.
Right.
That class aspect of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And it made it easier for me as a touring musician to go into these areas, because now I'm going to be a black dude playing rock music for a minute, but our conversation is going to be the same conversation because we come from the same world or a similar world. And I'm talking about, I'm going out into the hills of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right.
Ain't nobody look like me. But the message is the same about the foot that's on your neck. And I feel like that is the rallying cry for the united left. And that's what we saw cats like Fred Hampton do when he went to places like the Appalachian Mountains and was uniting union miners and stuff like that. And I mean, I love learning about theory. I dig it, but there is something to be said about real action.
Mm-hmm.
And cats don't want to get beat over the head with a bevy of big words and Das Kapital and all the other stuff. They want to know, okay, well, how's this going to help me today?
Right.
What do we need to do now? And that's what I feel like sometimes I don't see as much of. I mean, I'm sure it's definitely going on in places, but I don't see that much of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there's a way that black working class people, right, and even black people who are like middle income but still have to work hard to maintain that income, like we at least have a certain set of ideas, a certain disposition about the United States, that allows us to criticize it, where there's familiar lines of criticism. We have we're suspicious, right? A lot of us, we always question about power, questioning power. Even if we might question power only to say that, black entrepreneurship is the solution, right? There's still that more critical disposition that, look, this society is not all it's cracked up to be, right? It has not functioned well historically for black people, right? I think a lot of people kind of have that, we all have that at a fairly young age. I think the problem with some of the coon ass folks you were talking about, and it's funny, when you brought that up, man, I was like, this guy really did live in the because that's definitely a distinct thing, that, the word that historically in most parts of even the South is associated with as a black, anti-black, epithet, modified and, more part of just like the way people use, other words, right? It's both the epithet. If you say it, like if you call them that, it's a problem possibly, depending on who.
Yeah.
If they use it about themselves, right?
Yeah.
It's
like the N-word. Yeah, it's real. Yeah. Break it down. Break it down, brother said. Break it down.
Right. So, but the thing about it, man, they don't really have, a lot of the working class people I grew up around with, whites in South Louisiana, they don't have the same suspicion or, just basic critical disposition about the society, right? They accept it. If anything, there might be some self-loathing about not succeeding, or maybe they'll criticize, cultural elites or, the very wealthy. But when it comes to political action, right, they've tended to, again, do what a lot of black people do as well, is to see economic independence either through the form of working those offshore jobs that are dangerous and but lucrative in some cases, doing that sort of thing, or engaging in some sort of entrepreneurial endeavor to try to become their own boss, right? So I think what we have to think about is how do we, in the South, in particular in South Louisiana, a lot of folks aren't familiar with unions that might give them a a way of talking about power and talking about their condition, that gives them both an analysis but also a solution, right? That we shouldn't have to accept these conditions on the rig or wherever else that we're accepting. And there's an odd sort of schism in South Louisiana. The offshore oil workers tend to be, not just non-union, but in a lot of cases anti-union, right? And then
Very anti-union. Yeah.
yeah, but then the petrochemical workers on land, the ones who are like in the refineries, uh, have been unionized, right? So I think there's an odd dimension to all of that, but of course, born out of the history. But I think that's another challenge we have, right? So there's the challenge of trying to organize Black people who are suspicious but still wedded to the Democratic Party throughout the South, but also these working class whites, in the Rust Belt and parts of the South and the Southwest, who who may be suspicious about some things, critical, but not necessarily having that same ready discourse to make sense of their world, right? That we have, um, with respect to Black people, right? There's much more in the way of, whether it's Black Lives Matter, New Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement. There's all kinds of, Black Power. There's all sorts of personalities, arguments, strategies that we can draw on, that I think, even if they're limited, right, they put us in a different position. So if a Black person's killed by police, we can identify that. If a white person's killed by the police, you can't say Black Lives Matter. You can't say New Jim Crow, right? And it's funny to hear how people like Michelle Alexander has tried to reckon with that. She even used the term that whites who are caught up in this carceral apparatus are collateral damage, right? That really it affected Blacks primarily, but whites who got caught up in the dragnet of the drug war were just simply collateral damage. And I just think that's a problem, right? I mean, we need to come up with analyses that actually include, working class people across the board, whether we're talking about the pandemic, the criminal justice system, or even just, the experience of working people in their jobs, right? I mean, there has to be a way for us to talk about those things together. That empowers everyone, right? That makes everyone feel that they're invested and that there's somehow a project that we can all be committed to, right? I mean, historically, that kind of has happened in some places, but it's tough to get there because if you start talking in those terms, people will call you a class reductionist, right? If you say that
Oh God, yeah.
That there's actually common concerns, right? So, but I just don't see, how else we do it, right? I don't see how we build a majority for the kinds of things that we want, including police reform, without, pulling together all sorts of different people. And I'm not sure what we witnessed over the last month was that. I think it was in that direction, but I just worry about like how deep some of the commitments run, or again, was this just an Instagrammable moment for some people? This was, remember, I don't know if you remember Coney 2012. Was this 2020, right?
Bruh.
This
Bruh.
the cause of the moment, but once, people move on other things, the pandemic, we find some better therapeutics or a vaccine, will people be just as willing to step out there and engage in these struggles? I hope so, but I'm not altogether convinced.
My fear is that, and then I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, so we'll end with this. And if all is good, hopefully I can have you back. We can continue this conversation.
Sure.
I'm really hoping we can. My fear is, I believe that Trump is done. I think that coronavirus is his Herbert Hoover moment. You can't come back with the amount of blood that's on his hands domestically just from this alone.
Right.
and his very arrogant mishandling, or his administration's very arrogant mishandling. I think Joe Biden is a horrible stopgap for what could potentially come next.
Right.
My fear is that you get someone from the far right that actually has that ideology and isn't just a narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
You get that Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon real mentality of white nationalism
Right.
in the White House that is going to be able to push forward that agenda with resounding applause.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see this upcoming 2020 presidency campaign?
Yeah, man. I think I'm there with you. Except I'm not 100% confident that he will lose, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and it's I've learned, right? So remember back during the 2016 election, I was actually in Australia. It was in Sydney for a week or so. And everybody I bumped into, like the receptionist in my hotel, people at one of the talks I gave, folks I was at dinner with, people I saw when I did this one guy who interviewed me for a radio show. Everybody was like, do you think Trump is going to win? Like that was the question they had. And I just
Mm-hmm.
kind of waved it off like, oh no, he's not going to win. Clinton's machinery is strong, and the Clintons have won a lot of elections over the years, and they're going to pull this one off. And I was kind of nonchalant about it, man. But it's like the Australians knew more about what was on the horizon than I did, And I think because the Sanders defeat back then was a blow. I think the consolation prize in my mind was, well, at least we don't get this idiot of Trump, right? Let's try to have, at least bring it back to the Clinton years, and we can fight Clinton in the ways we need to. But I think that election was tragic, and I'm not convinced yet that that he'll be defeated. Right? We know that the Democrats have this knack for basically snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, right? That this is what they do. This is what they do, right? And having sat through, Al Gore 2000,
Oh.
and then the 2016 election, the re-election of George Bush, right? I mean, I thought back then George Bush wasn't going to get, W wasn't going to get reelected, after everything that he had done wrong. And I was wrong there. So I'm not, as far as the line of political scientists who try to predict, I know I'm not good at that. And I'm not willing to say that he's down, right? I think a lot can happen between now and November. And, the country's divided, as it was before. There are people who were energized after the last month of protests, but we got a long ways to November. And, like you said, Biden is not the best alternative, right? As he's not the best electoral alternative, right? The person to try to defeat Trump. And Biden has some of the same qualities, right? He's a person who appeals to people, and he seems unscripted and kind of a man of the people. But he also has a knack for gaffes and for saying dumb
Yes.
shit. And a
lot of dumb shit.
I just wonder about that. And I think the other thing too, and I kept saying this to people back when, Sanders was losing, and it was like, well, the black vote is going to, if he can't win the black vote, then he can't win the national. And that's kind of not true, right? Like that, Biden will get the black vote, right? And it's not going to even matter, right? In most of the South,
Yep.
it's not going to matter in places that are already safe for the Democrats. The places that are going to matter in this election are, really the old Rust Belt. And Biden is not the guy who you want to go toe to toe with Donald Trump on the record of Democrats and jobs, you know, in the old industrial heartland. He's not the guy, right? He cannot. He'll suffer from the same weaknesses as Clinton, maybe even worse, right? Uh,
You think so?
yeah, in a way that he can't necessarily. I mean, he supported NAFTA, he supported Trans-Pacific Partnership, so I think there's ways that he'll be stuck to the kind of neoliberal free trade project that will make some voters suspicious of him as the person they want to follow, right? And again, it may not work for Trump the second time around, right? I mean, that's what he was able to hammer on. That's how he was able to snatch away a number of those states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, those places, Ohio. I just think that, those are still going to be the battlegrounds this time around. And maybe some parts of the upper South, right? The coastal upper South. But I just don't know if Biden can pull it off, right? I just don't know if when we get into if they debate how he'll look. We know that Trump hasn't done the things he said he was going to do. That was how he won the first time. It was this appeal to people in Rust Belt cities and towns who felt that they got screwed by these free trade agreements, and his promise of protectionism and tariffs and all this other stuff. It hasn't delivered, but he can at least point to those pre-pandemic numbers, right? I'm not saying it was his responsibility or his policy that gave those numbers, or whether or not those are useful indicators of how the economy is working, right? But I just think that that's going to be one problem for Biden is trying to surmount the case that he's not going to bring us back to the free trade policies that just didn't work for many Americans. The other thing too, man, I just think that this, he is, Trump is terrible, right? There's no debating that as far as I'm concerned. His handling of the pandemic has been disastrous, and that could possibly hand the election to Biden, right? If the numbers continue to climb, which they will, and people really experience it. Because I think that's one of the problems right now, right? There's the cities that got hit hard the first time, as the first wave. And then there are places where people just have been in denial, right? I went into a Best Buy earlier today, and there are people just walking around, no mask. I drove past a Planet Fitness.
Hella close to each other.
Yeah, I drove past a Planet Fitness. The parking lot is packed, so it's kind of like the people who are in denial about this, and they haven't felt it, in the sense that people they know have actually died from it. But I think if the numbers continue to climb and we hit, as they were predicting before, 200,000 deaths by September, that could happen sooner, possibly, I'm thinking. I think you might see some people who will say, you know what, enough is enough. We needed a real response to this. But I'm just worried, man. I think you're right, though. I'm worried about the election, but I think you're right that even if Biden wins, I seriously doubt, even though I'm hoping I'm wrong, that he's going to do what's necessary to consolidate the Democratic Party around an agenda that's going to become solid, right? It has solid support among not just an electoral base that can continuously win, but that can get things done in Congress that we might want, right? So I think we could end up with a situation where, Biden's elected, the Senate remains Republican majority, and has the capacity to stop things, and we keep a Democratic majority in the House, and we're kind of like in a place where, exactly as you are predicting, the same forces who are arming themselves, who are, have been sort of unleashed by a Trump, White House, and by the same nefarious figures you just mentioned, they're still going to be around, right? And even if we set aside the most extreme elements, there are many voters who are going to look at Biden. They're going to see him as ineffective because he won't be able to get past that Senate majority of Republicans, and they're gonna lose faith in something more than a cultural politics, which is what Biden is already banking on giving us, right? Here's the thing, that's been the new democratic model since the late 1980s, right? When they were threatened with those two unsuccessful campaigns by Jesse Jackson, where Jackson does well. He won South Carolina, right? He did well in a number of states in '84 and '88. Jesse Jackson, at least gestured towards a return to New Deal liberalism, right? And I'm not saying that that's adequate, right? We need much more than that in this moment. But when he did that, the Democratic Party establishment, and in particular those who form the Democratic Leadership Council, they decided, look, we're not going to play those politics anymore. We're not going to play redistributive politics. We're going to move to the right. And if anything, we'll appeal to the traditional basis of the Democratic Party through a kind of cultural politics, right? That's how we end up with, Bill Clinton playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall, right? It was like, or even, you remember that, right? Or even
I hella remember that.
Yeah, or even like, Toni Morrison, right? The late poet, right? She refers to him in jest, right? She's joking doing this commencement address or whatever address it was where she says that he's the first black president because he's like approximate this kind of like stereotypical dysfunctional, child of a dysfunctional family, right? But I think that's what they continue to give us. It's not the redistributive politics that would shore up a working class base. It's actually the cultural politics that might allow them to pull off an election now and then. And that's what worked well during the Obama years. It was like the cultural politics on overdrive, the beautiful black family, the president who could sing and who looked good in a suit and walking across, you could see him on the beach with his shirt off, like that kind of stuff that was attractive to people, like literally. But underneath it was the same bullshit, man. I mean, there was a clear aversion to single payer health care, something that Obama had supported earlier on in his career before he was on the national stage. And so I think, his doctor in Chicago was a huge proponent of single payer health care. But anyway, so I just think that they're going to give us more of that, which is cultural politics and a half-ass, set of social policies that tilt towards capital. And I think that is going to, as you said, is going to inflame the same constituencies who put Trump in office. And it's also going to make this volatile situation of, white supremacist groups and neo-Nazis and all sorts of other elements, possibly even more dangerous, right, in our midst. So I think those are a lot of things we got to watch. But I guess if I had to end on a rosier note, maybe we can take some hope from what the Sanders camp was able to achieve in terms of building support for Medicare for all. All of the elections of more progressive kind of left of center politicians, even and some who identify as socialists at the national, but also the state and local level. And maybe these social struggles, right? Whether it's anti-policing or even some of the union struggles, right, and the labor struggles that we saw earlier this spring, right? Maybe all of those things, could congeal into something that pushes a Biden presidency in a different direction, or first of all elects him, right? But then also pushes him to something that the Democrats haven't done historically, right? I mean, that would be the optimal situation, and from there, maybe we could push for other kinds of things. But I just think we got a long haul in front of us, man. I mean,
Yeah.
but I think you're
Regardless.
right.
Yeah.
I think the scenario, the nightmarish scenario you point out is very much a real possibility, and
Oh yeah.
it's making me really appreciate these skills I'm learning during the pandemic. We might be hunkered down somewhere.
It's scary.
Grow your own food and clean your musket or something. You know what I mean?
Hey, it's bruh, it is real out here. And it's funny, man, because I live the studio I'm speaking to you from right now is across the street from an extremely large homeless encampment in the city of Oakland.
Right.
And these cats, it could be Trump, it could be Obama, the camp was still there.
Right.
It doesn't affect them. And even the unhoused people that I work with, some of them may have an opinion about the president, kind of, sort of.
Right.
But overall, they're like, look, man, I was homeless under Obama. I'm homeless under Trump.
Yeah.
My homelessness doesn't change under these cats. And I think what happens is the people that are fighting so hard for a Biden presidency, once Trump is out of office, they're going to exhale.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they understand. It's like, no, this is not the exhale time.
Right.
Because the far right is sharpening their tool. They don't care if he wins or loses.
Right. They're literally sharpening their
it's like cats don't understand, because I think a lot, to your point about these coastal elites, unless you go out into what they call the flyover cities. Yeah. And I spent so much time not just living in the South, but playing 100 and some shows domestically a year in the middle of the country, that 2012 was the first year I was scared to be black in America.
Right.
Because that was Obama's second term, and there was a lot of people that was mad because nothing changed for them. That BP oil spill shined a light on things for people in the South that live off that economy.
Right.
That's generational down there. And to know, like, okay, my grandfather did this oil work, I'm finna do this oil work, or shrimping, or whatever it may be. Like, this is just how we live. Mm-hmm. And then your livelihood is just done.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was done. But BP got kind of sort of bailed out.
Right.
And then they paid, what was it, like a $20 billion fine, but still reported record profits.
Yeah.
That resonated with a lot of people. That all happened. That happened. Yep, happened under Obama.
Yeah.
And cats, I'd pull up in town, man. I'm not even trying to be funny. Cats looked at me like I was Obama.
He was a surrogate down there.
I was an Obama surrogate, so they had to get a racing class lesson real quick. Like, hey.
Right.
I didn't win my Obama prize. I'm just as mad as you, homeboy.
Right.
But it's real, and I think we miss that.
Right.
When you live in these cities, these coastal cities, because there's no. What do you really want to go if you live in LA? What do you really want to go to Kansas City for, or St. Louis for?
Right. There's no need at all.
The barbecue is really good there.
Right.
But real talk, like, cats don't want to go there because there's no need to go there. There kind of is nothing there because deindustrialization has destroyed these cities.
Yep.
And these are, again, back to my whole question about organizing. Like, these are the places where cats need to be.
Right.
Really want to make a difference.
Right. Absolutely, man.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
No, thank you for having me, man.
We went 2 hours on this one. So if I can get you back again, I want to have almost like a panel-like discussion if possible. Do you know Angela Walker, the Green Party VP candidate?
Right, I've heard of her. I don't know her. I don't know her personally.
I would love to get you two talking together, because it's a very soulful, real talk
Sure.
that I think cats need to hear.
Let's
But
do it.
I'm gonna play some music. Please don't hang up.
Okay.